Greetings and salutations, friends. Today we will be venturing into the deep, dark forests of Athel, the ancestral homelands of the Wood Elves. The Wood Elves are one of those races that have undergone quite significant changes since their previous edition. Now, I'll grant you, the edition that I actually played the Wood Elves in, way back in the late 1900s, the Wood Elves 4th edition, was, let's just say, pretty goddamn old at this point in time, and the new codex is, properly updated and has had some rather major lore changes to it, so I found that a lot of my lore was actually quite outdated when I began reading the new Wood Elf Army book. But after conducting my usual research and rereading the book and the old one over again, I've figured I've got a relatively good grasp on it. And it's not like it went in a bad direction. I think it's gone in a pretty interesting direction, although it has changed significantly in tone. The old Wood Elf Army book portrayed the Forest of Loren almost as a paradise kind of place where the elves lived in perfect harmony and with nature and all of that bollocks. But after the events of what the Wood Elves themselves simply refers to as the Betrayal, the forest has changed quite significantly, and its basic background has also changed quite a lot. Now, before we even get to the Betrayal, we'll start right out with Athel itself. Now, geographically, it lies essentially surrounded by the Grey Mountains and the Vaults, protecting its eastern and southern borders, although, they're protected in a way, as in, most Empire armies won't bother crossing the mountains, and there are a few dwarves that live in the areas that sometimes decide to go off lumberjacking in the Forest of Loren with predictable consequences, or in the hunt for some long-lost treasure, or, alternatively, being dwarfs, they're simply just venturing into the forest to revenge some long-lost warband who originally ventured into the forest either in search of, yet another grudge or, lumbering. The forest itself is divided into 12 realms, ruled by powerful elf nobles. Now, the forest itself lies in Bretonnia and is technically a part of Bretonnia, though, I wouldn't try telling any of the Wood Elves that, because I suspect they might disagree quite aggressively to that notion. And the woods themselves are quite unique. These are by no means the bright and fairy-filled forests of common fantasy myth. The forest can be a very, very dark and dangerous place indeed, but it can also be a very bright and peaceful place. And all of these things are rolled into a relatively small area. Now, the reasons for this can be debated, though in all due likelihood, judging by the canon lore, the official lore, essentially it states that the forest was awoken, so to say. The forest came alive. The trees started, thinking and that kind of stuff. Not as individual trees, but as a forest-wide intelligence, as a single super being almost. Coincidentally, this seems to have happened around about the time of the fall of the Chaos Warp Gates. Meaning, of course, that the trees started thinking round about the time that the world was completely soaked through in chaos energy. Seems a bit of a stretch to consider the two as unrelated, especially considering that the forest itself is home to some rather magical things, shall we just say. For example, time flows completely different within the forest. You can spend weeks on a forest trail and appear mere minutes from the position you originally started. Several of the realms within the forests are completely out of whack with the normal cycle. For example, the realm of Aranok, also known as the Summer Strand, is perpetually in a state of summer, and there is virtually no nighttime in this realm. And the reverse is true for the realm of Athel, which is cursed, by Wood Elf standards, by eternal winter, which makes it practically identical to Norway just a few years ago. Or the realm of Mudrin, the Night Cleanse, which is a realm that is perpetually dark. It is essentially always night time, which has caused the locals to be rather edgy, shall we say. And this effect on the ones who lives there is even more apparent in Vidrioth. This realm borders the Grey Mountains and has been the target of quite a few dwarf expeditions, and as such the locals are particularly bloodthirsty. And while being a human walking around in any area of Athel Loren is quite the hazard sport, anything that is not a wood elf trying to get into Vidrioth is, its life expectancy is short, to say the absolute least. The way the forest seems to bend time and even seasons to their will, and particularly the way it messes with the timelines, is a rather interesting fact, because, seeing as, well, the trees are alive and all that, we have to start thinking, okay, why are the trees alive? Well, according to some more of the lore, there are several types of woodland spirits inhabiting the Forest of Loren. These spirits are generally divided into four kinds: treemen, treekin, spites, and dryads. And I'll cover them in greater detail in just a bit, but in essence, all of these types are, as their name suggests, forest spirits. And what are spirits in the Warhammer world? Well, they're creatures of the warp, so essentially, they're demons. And as I have explained previously, demons do not necessarily have to be evil. Although bear in mind that the woodland spirits of Athel Loren are most definitively not your stereotypical Disney cuddly fairies. However, the point is that spirits are able to live within the forest and take on physical form, to a degree that simply should be impossible in the material realm. If you couple that with the fact that the forest seems to have a certain knack of screwing with time and even seasons, it seems reasonable to assume that the veil between the material world and the Immaterium is extremely thin in Athel Loren, to the point where it almost seems fair to call the forest a realm of chaos. This theory is further reinforced by the fact that one of the realms within the forest is called Arguillon, or the Moonspring Glades, a place where the veil between the material world and the Immaterium appears to be particularly thin, to the point where the wood elf mages, known as spell singers, appear to be able to cast rather considerable magic with very, very little effort. They can summon considerable hosts of spirits, and can even carry out terraforming magic, which is particularly taxing on the mage. And while all of these things points towards the Forest of Athel Loren being essentially a realm of chaos, that does not necessarily mean that it is a force for evil, although it is most definitively not a force for good either. You see, the forest itself is hostile, just flat out hostile to us normal living creatures. The elves who live inside the forest now made a pact with the forest to protect it and tend to it in return for being allowed to live within it and share in its bounties and in some of its protection. But pretty much any other living creature that tries to venture into the forest is either going to be killed off by the local tenants, the Elves, or is going to find itself torn to pieces by some of the woodland spirits. And while these are purely defensive measures, it is quite important to actually stress the fact that Loren has, to this point, never shown any signs of attempting to expand its borders. The trees haven't simply just uprooted and started marching into Bretonia to lay claim to more land, so you could definitely consider it a neutral influence, as it is not offensively trying to expand its realm, but it also suffers absolutely no intrusion whatsoever into its territory. As for the elves themselves, you might be wondering if wood elves, high elves, and dark elves are separate species. They are not. They are the same species, although there is an argument to be made that the influence of Loren itself has changed the wood elves in fundamental ways from their elf cousins. But originally they were high elves. They were colonists who essentially fled into the forest after having their original colonies along the coasts destroyed during the Great War of the Beard, a rather innocent-sounding name for the rather apocalyptic conflict that took place between the dwarves and the high elves before the rise of men. A war in which the strengths of both dwarves and high elves were sorely depleted, to the point where these great races, who had at this point ruled great swaths of the old world, are now confined in a few mountain ranges and the island of Ulthuan. Now, moving back to the forest spirits. Now, as for the forest spirits themselves, I've called them demons, which might already have made you think that they are vile and evil creatures, and while some of them are, they are not universally aggressive like the demons of proper Chaos powers along the lines of Khorne, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, Nurgle, etc. We'll start out with the Treeman. The Treeman is essentially Loren's version of a greater demon. It is the result of a particularly powerful spirit merging with a tree. Though, interestingly enough, while the Treekin, the Spites, and the Dryads all inhabit dead trees, the Treemen are the only ones that are still alive, so to say, as in the spirit possesses, essentially, a living tree. And I think the term possession is actually the correct one to use in this case, because once the spirit has merged with the tree, the spirit may not leave the tree, much like as if it had possessed a human, which brings further credence to the whole demon theory, as the only way to separate spirit from tree at that point is to kill the tree. And as you might imagine, killing a tree is complicated. The Treemen are large, they are exceptionally strong, and while slow, being, a tree, they are not to be taken lightly in combat. More than a match for pretty much any mere human warrior, and while not quite up to the snuff of a full-on greater demon, it'll certainly give pretty much any monster a run for its money. However, it is a tree, and even though it's not quite as ridiculously flammable as its dead counterpart, it's still wood. It still burns very well indeed, and in fact, fire holds a certain primordial fear for all of the spirits of Loren, though while they are afraid of the fire, it also drives them batshit insane with anger and hatred. They do possess basic personalities, however, they have a slight character flaw in that their primary emotions are precisely anger and hatred. They are essentially connected to the forest as a whole, and so, well, they essentially feel every single tree, which means that whenever a tree gets chopped down or burned by an invader, they get angry. And considering they can be alive for thousands of years, remembering every single tree that's been cut down or burned during that period, well, let's just say that the Treemen tend to be remarkably angry creatures, even by Warhammer standards. Then we have the Treekin. The Treekin are lesser spirits that inhabit dead wood and trees, and they can shape these objects more or less to their choosing. They are capable of remaining motionless for literally years on end, and are virtually indistinguishable from normal dead trees. This, combined with their habit of essentially just standing there for years on end and then viciously ambushing any non-wood elves that pass by, seems to suggest that they are essentially the forest's guardians, its silent sentries. Which probably means that they're fairly weak spirits. They are minor pieces of the Chaos realm that is Athel, Loren, which is scattered across the land as guards and as ambushers, things to kill off unwary intruders. Though they can also be roused in great numbers and brought to war along with the Wood Elf army, where they essentially serve as shock troops. Then we have the Spites. The Spites are essentially spirit creatures that have inhabited the world in their purest form. They are essentially energy. They are minor demons that can only really exist in a place where the veil between the worlds is particularly thin, as they don't have to inhabit a particular piece of wood or a tree or anything like that. They don't have to possess anything. They exist as demons in our world. This means that Spites come in virtually any size, any shape, and can look like pretty much anything, which is quite handy for them because, well, they are particularly vicious little creatures. You might go so far as to call them outright cruel, really, playing rather malicious and cruel jokes on people or residents of the forest. And while tricksters, they don't have much of a sense of humor, and so if any person, or even a wood elves, should inadvertently, or even on purpose if he's particularly stupid, insult or play a trick back on the Spites, well, he's gonna find himself dead very, very quickly indeed, as the Spites are incredibly quick to anger. Even a person just simply not falling for one of their tricks can be enough for them to inhabit some dead tree or call their brethren, the Treekin or Dryads, to come and just kill the person. A far cry from your average Disney fairy, in other words. The last one are the Dryads, and well, if you thought the Spites seemed a little bit spiteful, ha 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 ha, the Dryads are even worse. They are the embodiment of the forest's hatred, of its anger and its aggression. They have virtually no comprehension of mercy or benevolence. They are utterly dedicated to the eradication of anyone that is not of the forest. Even wood elves have to tread relatively carefully around dryads. And if they find a human or a dwarf, gods forbid, wandering around inside their forests, they will attack without mercy. There will be no questions as to why he's there. There will be no attempts to scare him away as one of the wood elves' rangers might. They'll simply butcher him for no reason other than, well, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. This anger and hatred does make them excellent shock troops though, and they can be roused in large numbers to fight alongside Wood Elves' armies. And while normally gathering such a huge amount of dryads and such a huge amount of elves in one place is going to lead to some trouble, and it usually does, The presence of a large enemy army is the perfect distraction, so if the Wood Elves somehow stir the ire of the Dryads, they can simply point over in the general direction of the enemy army and go, "Oi, Lumberjacks, kill!" And the Dryads will generally oblige them. Now, all of this makes it sound like most of these creatures don't have much of a mind of their own, and they don't. The Spites in particular, for example, have the personality of particularly large and vicious pricks. Comparable to internet trolls, just slightly more violent. But the Treekin and Dryads have virtually no personalities. They're simply there to kill whatever gets into the forest, so their personality borders on the psychotic. It would be easier to compare them to a bloodletter demon of Khorne than it would be to compare them to a human. However, the Treemen can be quite different. The Treemen can possess personalities and even relatively potent intelligence. Although they too are often influenced indirectly by the state of the forest. If the forest is under direct attack, they're probably going to be quite damn angry about it. If the forest is peaceful, they'll be peaceful. They'll sleep away the years in slumber, being virtually indistinguishable from a normal tree. They'll simply just stand there and chill out for years on end. However, you have the occasional Treeman who goes off the deep end, so to say. For example, the rather famous Treeman Quedil. Now, I haven't the faintest if I'm actually pronouncing that correctly, but we'll go with that for now. Quedil is one of the most ancient treemen of the forest of Athel, Loren, and he used to be a relatively staunch ally of the Wood Elves. However, it would appear that over the hundreds of years, either Quedil himself has been driven insane by the forest's rage and anguish at the loss of all the trees he has witnessed, or he might have contracted just the faintest bit of chaos taint within him, which drove him to the act of treason, known now by the Wood Elves as the Betrayal. Before I touch upon the Betrayal itself, I'll give you the general information you need to understand just what kind of a massive treasonous act this actually was, and it begins with the religion of the Wood Elves. The Wood Elves worship the twin deities of Cernus and Isha. Cernus is the elven god of the hunt and lord of beasts. He is a pretty considerably powerful spirit, and in the forest of Loren he is capable of something that virtually no other deity is. He is capable of taking manifest form in the form of Orion, the king of the forest. Now, this is virtually unheard of in the Warhammer world. This is literally an avatar of a god, capable of manifesting himself more or less at will. The ancient elves were able to master some of their gods and employed them as tools, creating avatars of them in the material world, yes, but that was a result of massive amounts of magical energy and a concentrated effort by the entirety of the elven race. While in this case, Orion, the avatar of Cernus, simply is. He exists within the forest of Loren as a living embodiment of the god of the hunt. And that's not all. You see, the other deity worshipped by the Wood Elves, Isha, the elven goddess of harvest and natural bounty, is also able to manifest herself in the forest in the form of Ariel, the queen of the forest, wife to Orion. Now, the simple fact that these demigods even exist is a virtual and impossibility within the Warhammer world. There is a theory that they might not in fact be the living avatars of their gods, because their origin story essentially Ariel and Orion were elves that were chosen to become vessels for their god's powers. However, this theory starts to fall apart a bit when you consider the simple fact that Orion and Ariel essentially die every single winter. They die and they are reborn in spring, and then they gain power through the summer until again they die in the winter. And particularly in Orion's case, his body essentially withers away to ash, which should constitute the destruction of his physical body, and therefore the release of his spirit, in this case, part of Kernus. Which means, of course, that the possession should have ended. So his rebirth that spring should be impossible. Now, again, considering that at this point Athel Loren is practically a realm of chaos, it's kinda hard to apply any kind of logic to it, but as far as I can tell, the explanations that they are simply possessed elves don't really seem to hold up that well. In my opinion, the original two elves were in all due likelihood essentially blood sacrifices of some of the most powerful elven mages present in the forest at that point, which bound parts of Kernus and Isha to the realm, because, well, the veil between the worlds in Athel Loren is so thin that spirits can walk it at will, and so it is not completely beyond the realm of possibility that part of a god could be bound to the area. Now, as I just explained, both Orion and Ariel die every winter, and is then reborn every spring. While they wait for their rebirth, they are entombed inside the Oak of Ages, a massive, mighty old oak that would appear to have been there since the beginning of the world itself, possibly even a creation of the mysterious Old Ones. And this is where the betrayal comes in. You see, pretty much every single winter, all of the woodland spirits fall asleep. The forest essentially hibernates during the winter months, and even the few spirits that are awake are sluggish and weak. However, the winter of the betrayal, Coedil the Treeman, and his dryad handmaidens were awake, and they attacked the Oak of Ages in an attempt to kill all of the Wood Elf wild riders, the ones responsible for carrying out the ritual to bring Orion and Ariel back into the world. As such, Coedil assumed that if he killed all of the wild riders, he would essentially kill the avatars of Kernus and Isha. However, Coedil misjudged his prey. He figured that Isha and Orion were so deep in slumber that they would be unable to interfere with his attack upon the Oak of Ages. But as more and more elf blood was spilled upon the ground in the King's Glade, Ariel awakened from her slumber, and in a rage, which is quite rare for the avatar of Isha, she defeated Coedil and his dryad handmaidens, and while she could not kill Coedil, she entrapped him inside the Wildwood, which is located in the southeast corner of Athel Loren. It is a forest surrounded by elven waystones, and these waystones have the curious effect of limiting the potency of magic, or, more correctly, the winds of magic, thereby the power of chaos. As such, treemen and dryads like Coedil cannot cross this boundary of waystones, because the moment they do, the power of chaos that animates them will simply be cut off, and they'll fall over dead and empty. Of course, Coedil and his dryad handmaidens are not alone in having betrayed the trust of Athel Loren and its elves. The Dryad Drisha is perhaps the most famous of the betrayers of the forest, having a deep hatred and resentment for the elves as well as all other living creatures. She's made multiple attempts to kill off the elves, if not destroy the forest itself entirely. And while Drisha is still on the loose, many of her compatriots have been captured and sent into the Wildwood, which of course means that the Wildwood itself is a gigantic prison filled with all manners of extremely aggressive and extremely angry spirits, only separated from the rest of the forest by what is essentially an electrified fence. So you can imagine that what would happen if this fence was to be somehow breached, as has been done before. Not in the Wildwood, mind you, but elf waystones have been destroyed or neutralized previously in the history of Athel. We can only imagine what would happen if that were to actually come to pass, if the forest of Athel was completely taken over by the extremely aggressive Dryads that essentially hate all living things, and they found a way to neutralize the elf waystones. Well, the very best case scenario is that simply the forest of Athel would become an even more dangerous place than it already is, and in the worst case scenario, the forest might begin to expand, deciding that the only way to properly protect the forest was to kill anyone and everything that might potentially threaten the forest. But now I've talked a bunch about the forest itself. What about its elven inhabitants? Well, as I mentioned earlier, they are essentially the descendants from elves that fled the colonies in the old worlds after the War of the Beard. They have preserved very little of their elven heritage, and only a few of the realms within Athel are even vaguely reminiscent of the High Elf holdings of old. The elves themselves are divided into several more or less warbands, or so-called kinbrecht, that live spread across the 12 great regions of Athel. Each of these regions is ruled by a powerful elf noble, and the smaller tribes, so to say, might also have their own local leader, although they are usually subject to the will of the realm leader. They live in peaceful coexistence, for the most part, with the forest fiercely protecting it against outsiders, and the deeper parts of the forest are usually pretty damn safe from the vast majority of evil and nasty creatures. Though the forest itself has on several occasions been invaded, and there is the long-standing so-called Secret War that has been raging for thousands of years, a war that very few outside of Athel actually know about. It is the war between the Wood Elves and the Beastmen, led by the Beast Lord Morgur, though at this point calling him a beastman might actually be a disservice. One could go so far as to say that Morgur is no longer a beastman, but the essence of mutation and corruption given corporeal form. His effect on the material world is such that his mere presence is enough to mutate most human beings. And he has been killed many, many times, often by the Wood Elves of Athel, but every single time he has merely been reincarnated in another place. And he has made it his personal quest to take over the forest of Athel, not because he's got a particular dislike of elves, or because he's a particularly harsh tree hater, but simply because the forest of Athel is a place where the realm between the worlds is particularly weak. So if a champion of chaos, the likes of Morgur, could take it over, especially considering that around him the veil is already so thin, imagine what he could do in a realm like Athel. He could essentially create a third chaos warp gate in the middle of the civilized world. which would in all due likelihood spell the end of the entire civilized world. To prevent this, every single wood elf is a warrior, or, well, a ranger might be more fitting. At the age where they are old enough to hold the bow, they are taught the skills of archery, and once they come of age, he or she is inducted in their family's glade guard, and is given responsibilities of patrolling an area of the woods. And in times of invasion and war, the glade guard is band together in units of varying sizes to drive off the enemy. The wood elves prefer guerrilla warfare tactics, but at the same time, the basic of guerrilla warfare is giving up land for time, and the wood elves will never voluntarily give up any part of their woods, although in many cases it is necessary, simply because there are not that many wood elves. And due to their sinking numbers, their primary weapon is of course the bow, a weapon perfectly suited for the kind of guerrilla warfare they are carrying out. Silent, accurate, deadly, and with a considerable range, the wood elf longbows are of a particularly exquisite make, and some of them even have spirits of the woods inhabiting them, making them uniquely potent weapons in the hands of skilled archers. A good example of this is that every single glade guard carries with him one arrow in his quiver, made in the Torguvan realm, inscribed with Ethris Idrion, meaning Tears of the Maker, a reference to the elven god Vaul. This arrow contains magical properties and is particularly devastating against magical beings, rumored to be able to take down even a dragon should they get through its powerful hide, and the arrow is to be used only in the most dire of circumstances. Amongst the glade guards, there is a particularly dangerous and honorable position, that of Deepwood Scouts. The Scouts are the ones that maintain the forest's outer boundaries, and the first ones to make contact with any would-be intruders. And these intruders are usually the powerful kind, because the people of Bretonnia have established a relatively stable alliance. Well, alliance is putting it a bit too harsh, I think. A non-aggression pact, I think, would maybe be a better description. So the Bretonnians very, very, very rarely venture into the forest of Athel, meaning that the poor little scouts will mostly be hunting beastmans, orcs, and dwarves that have come prepared for a fight. And on occasion, they will be fighting considerably more horrible opponents. The forest of Athel has come quite close to falling on several occasions, once due to the machinations of an undead necromancer who almost overran the forest with a horde of undead, and once at the hands of a massive orc war, which devastated considerable portions of the forest during the Winter of Woe. As such, while the forest of Athel is a dangerous, yet on the surface peaceful place, it is under constant threat from invasion. And in these dark times, where even some of the woodland spirits themselves have turned upon the elves, it is far from the paradise it once appeared to be. As for the Wood Elves' internal relations, well, the realms are, of course, de facto allies against the potential intruders of the forest, but there is plenty of bickering between the realms, as each and every one of the 12 realms have their own laws and their own customs. But generally, open conflict is pretty damn rare. Now, there is no real shared currency within Athel. In some cases they do use precious minerals, but mostly it's simple commodity trade of one commodity for another. Their foreign relations are, well, very, very simple really. They have a standing non-aggression pact with Bretonnia, and they have a standing pact of open hostility towards pretty much anyone else. Even their elven brethren, the High Elves attempted to get some kind of dialogue started with the Wood Elves, but Ariel refused to forge closer ties with the High Elf Phoenix Court, fearing that this was merely the beginning of an attempt by the High Elves to reassert their dominion over the Elves of the Forest. I'll go into more detail on how their army works and is organized in my army video, which will be coming relatively shortly once you've seen this video. So until then, I have been Arch, hope to see you soon in the army video, and thank you very much for watching. Have a good day.